we have. So.
Hi, I'm Brian Rittenhouse. I'm the treasurer with the group. Just a quick update. Our last February meeting, we had 40 paying members, and we've had one paying member for this meeting. We're going to keep dues at $10. Moving forward, probably our next meetings will be sent out to active members, paying members only. So we'll work out the details if people out there still want to become members of how we can get dues paid moving forward. So with that said, here's Kurt.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Like to welcome everybody here. As Rich mentioned, they were forging new territory here, doing a virtual presentation like this. Just to kind of give you an idea of what we've got, we're in the conference room at Greater Peoria Sanitary District here in Peoria. We've got basically the Heart of Illinois group, the board is present here, so there is about 7 or 8 people here, and definitely want to thank Greater Peoria Sanitary District and their willingness to host it, and particularly their IT department and staff here for working on the technology for this. Just introduce myself, a little bit of background here, and again, I have no idea at the moment if I'm talking to 5 people or 100 people. But anyway, I'm sure most of you probably know me, seen me, heard of me. My name is Kurt Stepping. See if hopefully you're seeing the presentation here. I'm right now I'm officially the technical director at PDC Laboratories. I've been senior project manager there prior to that. I started in the wastewater industry in 1979 at Chillicothe Sanitary District, worked there for a year. With Daily Analytical Laboratories for 19 years, and in 1999, PDC Laboratories acquired Daily Analytical Laboratories, been there ever since, and in case you're not aware of it, I will be retiring at the end of this year, at the end of December. So I'd like to welcome everybody, glad you're here. The topic today, the title, hopefully you can see on the screen here, is Sample Acceptance, Do's and Don'ts. By sample acceptance, what this is referring to is when you send your samples to, particularly to a contract laboratory. And we'll get a few more details that as we get into this in a few minutes, but most of your contract laboratories are going to be accredited by TNI. And the TNI, let me back up, stands for the NELAC Institute. And it used to just be NELAC, and NELAC is the acronym for the National Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, NELAP. So basically it's a national program. I want to say there's maybe 15 states that participate, and in Illinois, it's the Illinois EPA is our accrediting authority. So they're the ones that kind of, NELAC and through the IEPA that drive the bus, so to speak, on this sample acceptance. Let's see, okay. Ken, okay. Why do we have to deal with this? Well, we mainly have to deal with this because somebody is saying we have to deal with it. And, okay, then we say, why are they saying that we have to deal with this? And it gets into several, a lot of things here. And, if you think about it, you're going out somewhere, a tank, an outfall, a stream, a sample point, drinking water, out in your distribution system, and you're going to get that sample, and you want to make sure that the integrity, it's the integrity of the sample is the main, is the main thing there. There's accountability, figures into this. There's regulatory oversight. Then, somebody's going to get that result. They're going to deal with it. It's going to become public record. There is documentation of it. And just, I always like to say, just kind of as a rule of thumb, if it's not written down somewhere, it didn't happen. That's just good way to think of it. And you think about all the things that go into, getting a sample through the laboratory and then the results getting put somewhere. Okay, scrutiny. Then nowadays, and to go back, and I realize it's a drinking water thing, but Flint, Michigan changed a lot of things for the laboratory industry. Laboratories all of a sudden are getting tougher audits, and part of this, what I referred to NELAC then, is the Illinois EPA comes, they're supposed to every 2 years, and they hit this pretty regularly. They come in and we have an on-site audit. And, nobody's perfect. They have findings. You deal with their findings, then you respond to those. You do corrective actions. You fix things. And as we're getting more and more scrutiny now, in the environmental monitoring, and testing, excuse me, then, it's more, a lot of this comes down to the laboratory, okay? Then validity, when you take your sample, and whether it's your drinking water BACTs or your effluent BOD or your SOCs or your fecal coliform, whatever it is, you want some assurance, or your customers want some assurance then that result then that gets posted out there, your DMR, it goes into the net DMR system, is that a valid number? And then there's legalities of it. And then ultimately what you want to know, or what you want to have in the end then, is where you've collected this sample, you filled out the paperwork, you've sent it to a laboratory, they did the result, they send you a report, you submit that report becomes public record. If somebody out there is going to throw rocks at you, or try to, and trust me, it doesn't happen a lot, but it will happen, then ultimately the question is, will it hold up? And will it hold up? If it goes to a litigation in a court of law, then will that sample result hold up? So that's kind of a quick run through of the why do we have to do this? Okay. In Illinois, now as far as the the accreditation, and I'm only going to speak for Illinois here. As far as the accreditation goes, if you are doing testing for drinking water compliance, then you have to use an accredited laboratory. And in Illinois, that accreditation, as I refer to, is through this TNI, the NELAC Institute, where Illinois EPA is the accrediting authority for this. Drinking water compliance, like I say, you have to use an accredited laboratory. A lot of drinking water facilities, the bigger ones in particular, they will do some things in-house. There's a handful that do everything in-house. Subcontract some, do some in-house. Well, your subcontract laboratory has to be accredited for it, and your in-house laboratory has to be accredited for those things that you do. There, okay? For wastewater, I realize this is a wastewater group presentation, but I know particularly with the smaller communities, a lot of you are also drinking water operators, or I'm sure a lot of you do both. Normally I'd say, okay, who's a drinking water operator too, but I guess under this format I can't see if you're raising your hand or not. But for wastewater, and this is in Illinois, you do not have to use an accredited laboratory. Okay, there are a handful that I'm aware of, bigger municipal laboratories or bigger municipal facilities that have an accredited laboratory out there. I know Metropolitan Water Reclamation District Greater Chicago has accreditation. I know Rockford has it. There's a couple others that I'm aware of, but again, I'm sure they're in the minority overall for the number of municipal wastewater labs. The commercial labs, it's available out there. The Illinois EPA will accredit you for wastewater, and wastewater test parameters, but you don't have to. It's not mandated for compliance, for your DMRs. You have your own in-house laboratory, and if you're a major discharger, there's a program that you participate in. I mean, there is some, level of quality assurance out there, and then your EPA inspectors, will come out, and I'm not sure what the frequency is nowadays, with everything going on with COVID, but they do that. But in theory, then they come out, they look at your lab, and you participate in DMR studies. There's round robin studies that you can participate in, and some level of that assurance. But for wastewater, like I say, you do not have to use an accredited laboratory for wastewater compliance. Again, most of the commercial ones are, And it's, I mean, it's some of that, is competition motivated, but most of them are. Okay. Okay, this may, I'm not sure if you'll be able to read this or not from the, don't unplug myself here, hold on. Okay, this is the actual language then that we have as a TNI accredited laboratory. Then we are required to have a sample acceptance policy, okay? And so we have this policy, and when we first came out with this, I would say this was over a year ago, there was a mass email, and that's one of the things in our accreditation is we have to be able to show, did you send, did you give this to all of your customers, people submitting samples to you. Okay, so yes, we mass distributed this when the policy was new. So in case this is difficult to see, I'll go ahead and read this verbatim here. And this is, from the first page of our, sample acceptance policy. And it refers to the TNI standard specifies requirements under which a NELAP accredited laboratory will accept or reject samples. Upon receipt of the samples at the facility, laboratory control staff will assess all samples based upon the below criteria, which we're going to go through more detail, a lot of that criteria here in just a couple minutes. That says the purpose of such criteria is to maintain the integrity of all samples submitted for the laboratory analysis. Okay, so that's getting back to the why do we have to do this. Okay, and that's, that is a copy, and I'm sure you're not going to be able to read that. We're not going to probably leave it up there long enough, but like I say, that is the official sample acceptance policy we have. If anybody would like to have a copy of that, email myself or your project. If you're drinking water, you deal with Janet Clutters or Margie Nobling at our lab. We'd be glad to email you a copy of that. Okay. The components of the sample acceptance policy. Probably one of the biggest ones that we have is the chain of custody. And most people probably just know that by the acronym COC. So I won't say chain of custody from this point, I'll just refer to it as COC. So that's not constituents of concern, which I know that we have dueling acronyms sometimes, but for this application, COC is chain of custody. Okay. Another component then of the policy then is the containers themselves. Like I say, I'll get into a lot more detail on all these things, but just to highlight here the various components. Okay, thermal preservation is what it's referred to, but basically that means temperature. Do you ice your samples? Do you not ice your samples? Some methods do, some don't. We'll get into more details on that. But that is becoming a much bigger thing right nowadays. And if it's drinking water samples, there is rejection requirements. Like I said, we'll get into the more detail on that as we go through more of the presentation. But these are the key components of the sample acceptance policy. Hang on just a second. Okay. Okay, pardon me there. Okay, the COC in the sample acceptance policy mean you shall have one. So when you send samples to a laboratory, along with those samples, then you've got to have this paperwork that comes with them. You can't just drop it off and say, "I'm Joe. Here's my BOD," or "Here's my back T sample." You've got to have this supporting documentation. And one of the key things, in that COC is it must be legible. I probably can be one of the worst offenders of that. Don't have good handwriting, but signatures are one thing. But when you fill these forms out, you want to make sure that it's legible. So take your time, print legibly, because if somebody misreads something and it doesn't get caught down the road, that result's going to go on a database somewhere. It's going to be in there, and somebody's going to say, well, you collected that sample wrong, or what's that address, or where did that sample come from, or I don't have an 001 discharge. I have an 001A or not a B, or something like that. But you want to, make sure, it's a key thing when you do that COC, make sure it's legible. Okay, then one of the first things that you come up to on the COC, and on again, it doesn't have to be our COC, but it does need to be a chain of custody form present. One of the and in ours, it will say, there'll be a heading there, and it'll say client on there. Okay, who are you? Who is sending that sample in? When we receive the sample, we need to know who are we working for on this, and a lot of times that can be misleading. We'll have contractors who will do work for somebody, and they'll submit it, and the contractor will put their name on there, or they'll put the facility name on there. But ultimately, from the laboratory's point of view, is who's getting the bill for it? That's the client. You can have extra copies, but we want to know it. That's kind of it doesn't say who are we working for, but that's basically what it means on there. Who's submitting this sample? Who are we working for? And part of that, then you'll have your name, address, contact name, phone number, and an email. Name and address, that's just, that's kind of an official thing. Phone numbers and emails, email in particular, becoming much more important now. I would say, definitely with PDC laboratories, other laboratories we work with, by and large, email is the desired format for getting you your results. It gets them to you much cleaner. It's cheaper. You're not dealing. It eliminates paper. So having an email address on that COC form is important. Now, once you're established and set up in a laboratory's LIMS system, you've got that information in there. And a lot of this stuff, I'll get ahead a little bit on one topic of the COC, is if you have a routine sample, if you're submitting the same BOD suspended solid ammonia, fecal, that kind of thing, time after time, then we can either provide you with a pre-printed form that has all the routine information that's repetitive there, or we can provide you our COC form in a PDF fillable format. So you can have that, your system, put all the stuff that's the same every time, your name, your address, phone number, email, repetitive sample locations, pretty much everything except the date and time you collected the sample on there can be pre-printed. You can have a stack of those forms. You can print them out as you need them, and then you're actually hand filling in a minimal amount of information every time you submit a sample. But that information does need to be there. Okay, sampler. Then who collected the sample? That's important on there. When we get back to the part about scrutiny, if there's a question down the road, was this a legitimate sample? Did you run the water? Did you not run the water? Was this happening? Was that happening? Was something turned on? Questions come up. You get that scrutiny down the road. Say, okay, who collected that sample? And again, that's a field on a COC form that can be pre-filled. If you always collect the sample, you can pre-fill that. Now the signature part, then that needs to be an actual signature on each individual COC form when you pardon me, when you submit that sample to us. Now if you have a pre-filled COC form and maybe one time you don't happen to collect the sample, somebody else does, you can edit the form, or if you can simply line it out. And again, this is a paper, some of the do's and don'ts on there. A definite don't is if there's something on that form, then like the sample collector name, then it's different for one particular time, then don't obliterate it. Don't scratch it all out so it's illegible. Draw a single line through it and then put your date and initial on it next to where you lined it out, and then right next to it, then who that is. Perfectly acceptable. Because that demonstrates then that, okay, yes, it was acknowledged, this is different, somebody edited it, corrected it, you see an initial and a date, and then you see what it should be. If it's just totally obliterated, then, that potentially can cast suspicion. Was it supposed to be changed? Is somebody hiding something? Whatever. So, it is important who collected the sample. Okay. Sample description. This is kind of, up to the person who collects the sample. Is where it says sample description, that is what we are going to put on our report to you. When that report comes back to you, then how do you want that to show up? And there's not necessarily a right or wrong on here, but it has to be meaningful and very specific to you or people using that report, once you get it back. And, examples of, sample description: influent, effluent, flume, 001, 002, outfall numbers, A's, B's, discharge, tap numbers, something that's very specific to you. So when you get that report back, then it's gonna refer to that. Drinking water, there's site numbers, lead and copper numbers, BACT site numbers, all that kind of stuff. And again, if it's a repetitive thing, these things can be pre-filled on a COC form. It's a lot of, I can totally see you go out to collect a routine sample, you don't want to fill out 8-10 lines that are the same thing time after time. But again, we can't assume that that's the same and get blank fields on a COC form. So that's important to do that. Okay, date and time. The very important thing here also then, and the reason that date and time is important is, and we'll get to more detail here on holding times, is these methods then do not have indefinite amounts of time from when you collect the sample to when it has to be analyzed. Then you can go anywhere from, fecal coliform, and the official hold time is 8 hours on there. Radiochemical analysis, trace metals, then 180 days. So you can see there's and quite a few in between. There's several there's some 24 hours, there's 30 hours, there's 48 hours, and then once you get past 48 hours, then it kind of jumps to 7 days, 14 days, 28 days, 180 days. But again, there are hold times on there, and when we put that sample, when we receive that sample, we log it into a laboratory management system, then you have a date and time in there. As work gets done on that sample, analysts then will put in there dates of sample preparation, dates of analysis, and then the system then will automatically look at what was the day and time that sample, and it is time specific also. Don't just put a date, we need a time also. The laboratory systems then will look at the date and time it was collected, the day and time it was prepared, it was analyzed, and then say, okay, and it knows what the time limits are for that method, and then it will come up, and on the results then in the system, it'll blink a big red flag at you and say, you need to put a data qualifier in here and say that this analysis was done, outside the recommended holding time per that method. And then just depending on what it is, whose the data is going for, and I'll get to that a little bit also then, it may or may not be considered acceptable data then. So that's why the time is very important also. Okay, sample type. Now this doesn't apply as much as say for drinking water, but for wastewater in particular, then you have permits where you have composite samples and then you have grab samples. Those are specified in your permit. If again, the scrutiny down the road, if it's an inspector and auditor is looking at your results and says, okay, well, your permit specifies, your BOD and your solids, for instance, as as composite samples, but your fecal and your volatiles, your grease and oil, phenol cyanide, and okay, those are supposed to be grab samples. Were they really a grab sample? There's your documentation right on the COC. And the other thing is, on the COC, which I just thought of here, when you fill out a COC form, back up a little bit, you have one line on the COC per sample location, which can be multiple bottles. You do not have to put a line on the COC for every bottle then. A drinking water SOC, you can have like 20 bottles on there. A back tea, you'll have one bottle. It's still one sample, but you can have multiple bottles. We'll get to the bottle number on there again, but just wanted to that'll make your life a little easier doing the COC paperwork. Is don't put a line for every bottle, put a line for every sample, and then you'll fill in a point that will tell you how many sample bottles are are for that sample. But again, the sample type for wastewater, that is important because you'll have permits then that will specify grab or composite, so you need to have the documentation that that was done right. Okay. Matrix type. Now, matrix refers to again the type of sample, that not composite or grab, but is this a wastewater sample? Is it drinking water sample? Is it groundwater? Something like that. And a lot of people think, well, what difference does it make? The difference is we need to know what the matrix is, because there are a lot of applications where the method that we use to do that analysis for you then is specific, and it's not necessarily acceptable across the matrices. Perfect example is mercury. If you have a wastewater sample that's a pretreatment sample and influent, then we use a cold vapor atomic absorption, method 245.1. If it's groundwater or if it's drinking water, then we have to use a ICP-MS method, then, which is more sensitive. It's allowable, it's more efficient from the lab point of view. If it's a final effluent under an NPDES permit, then you more than likely will have to use the fluorescence method, what we refer to the low-level mercury method, which we currently subcontract those. So, it's important again to identify, is it a drinking water sample, is it a wastewater sample? And like I say, the reason for that is so we apply the proper methods for that, so that, again, down the road, here's that scrutiny, it gets on a website somewhere, an auditor, an inspector's looking at that, and if it's wastewater, they're going to say, okay, well, wastewater, you have to use 40 CFR Part 136 methods are the acceptable methods then. If we thought it was a drinking water sample and did your mercury by method 200.8 or 6020, something like that, other than 245.1, then it's not going to be acceptable. So again, that's the reason, why that why that is important to us. Bottle count, again, that's back to what I mentioned a minute ago, is you will have one line on your COC per sample. Now, a composite sample is different than a grab sample. So you may have one sample location, but your composite is a line on the COC and it might have 2 or 3 bottles. Your grab is a separate line on the COC, and it will have, it may, depending on your application, it will have, 1, 2, 3, several bottles potentially there. For each line on the COC, then, which is technically considered a unique sample, then you just need to indicate how many sample bottles do you have. And then again, that's this, this ultimate scrutiny thing here is when it gets to the laboratory, we open, and packages get sent in UPS, and it doesn't happen often, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility that a tape pops off a cooler or a box or something like that, something falls off, and somebody, the UPS conveyor system somewhere, okay, they scoop it all back up and they put it in. One of the bottles rolls away. Okay, if you don't say how many bottles are on there, we're not going to know that. A bottle breaks, or something gets dropped, smashed. We open it up, there's a bunch of broken glass in there. We got 2 bottles and a bunch of broken glass. Well, how many bottles broke in there? So that you're telling the laboratory this is how many bottles you should have. Now I realize sometimes with sampling there'll be one time something happens and you don't have, okay, so again, if you have to correct that, if you have a pre-printed form that says 4 bottles and there's some legitimate reason why it's only 3, or you're adding something one time, then and it's 5. Say, for instance, single line, date and initial through the wrong number, and then write in the correct number on there. So when that hits the door, then the lab just validates then that, okay, you say you're sending me 5 bottles. Yes, I got 5 bottles. Okay. Analysis requested. Now, hopefully you can see the red on there, critical. You know, we need to know, well, I mean, we know most times, you know, we have templates in our system. We call them schedules. And for your sewage treatment plant effluent that you do every day, once a week, once a month, whatever the frequency is, here's the tests you do. But again, somebody down the road looking at that, you know, looks at the test result, and I mean, I sat in a deposition before, you know, with a lawyer that says, okay, here's the test you did. Why did you do those tests? Well, this is what we were requested to do. Then, I mean, you can drill down as deep as you want. Well, why are you requested? Well, that's what's in the permit. I mean, but anyway, you know, when the sample hits the, you know, the lab, then we need the documentation there that says these are the analysis that you're supposed to do. Sometimes, you know, we'll see, it'll say the usual, what I always do. Okay, yeah, behind the scenes, we likely may know that, but again, you know, here's where the pre-printed COCs come into play. Then, okay, yeah, it's my BOD suspended solids ammonia, you know, sample that I do all the time. It needs to be there, and those can be pre-printed forms. And again, we realize stuff changes. Edit the form, you know, line something out, date initial, but again, that form needs to reflect then what you're doing on that specific sample. Now, I've seen instances, like some special studies. You look at that form, and it was kind of designed around the, you know, the weekly routine samples, 5 or 6 parameters. If it's a big long study, and you can reference see attached. Well, if you do that, just make sure the attachment's there. If your consultant said, okay, here's a permit renewal, and here's everything you need to test for on there, it would be acceptable to write permit renewal, see attached, you know, and then have an attachment on there that has a list on there. But we need something that's, you know, unambiguous as to what we need to do on that particular sample. And here again, this emphasizes routine, repetitive things. There's certainly no reason why you can't have that pre-printed. Like I say, we provide a fillable PDF format. If you want to take a blank one, handwrite everything that's routine on there, photocopy it, and then, you know, just fill in the unique things for every time, that's perfectly acceptable also. And I say, and to fill space on these things, if you're doing a semi-annual metals analysis, use of acronym is common. You don't have to write out biochemical oxygen demand 5-day. You can put BOD down. You know, we'll get that. Like I say, it's an alphabet soup out there, but I just say, particularly like with trace metals, if you don't know the chemical symbols, then you might want to spell it out or put an attachment on there. We have done borons instead of bariums, or bariums instead of berylliums, and you know, those kind of things. You know, some examples: cadmium instead of calcium. And again, this is where it's right legibly on there. Cu, you know, for copper can easily be misread as a Ca on there. Now, if we have templates set up, that will help on that, but that's the, you know, that's the emphasis again of, you know, be legible on there. If somebody, you know, makes a, you know, misreads something, makes a mistake, then you don't want your result to come back and have somebody down the road say, oh, you weren't supposed to do that, you're supposed to do this. Then, you know, some things, trace metals, you know, we typically scan for more than what we report, you know, so we can go back and recover those a lot of times. But if you wanted a phenol and we didn't do it, and it's a month later, it's too late for that sample. You can't go back and recover that. So, like I say, it has to be clear and ambiguous. You know, what analysis then are you wanting the laboratory to perform for you? Okay, relinquished by, received by. Okay, this is the true chain of custody part of a COC form. A lot of the other stuff, I mean, it's called a COC form, but a lot of the other stuff really isn't the chain of custody, it's just the documentation that supports that sample. But the true chain of custody part on there should start with the person who collects the sample. So, going back to before, there will be a place on your COC form that says sampled by, and then there'll be a signature on there. Okay, you want to print your name on that. Okay, then the person collecting the sample, then at some point in time you give that sample up. Now, if you're the sample collector, you drive it to the laboratory, then you don't relinquish it till you get to the laboratory. Now, if a courier picks it up or somebody else besides the sample collector is going to do it, then you relinquish the sample to that person and that person receives it. And again, there's multiple places on the COC form that will say received by, relinquished by. If you use a common carrier, UPS, FedEx, the post office, they will not get involved in that. They just will not do that. So what we tell people there is you, at the time that you're packing that sample up and you're putting it in a cooler, you're taping it up, you're sealing it, that's when you relinquish, you're relinquishing the sample at that point in time. That's why there's a spot on the COC, which, I did not mention that, thought of that. There is a spot on the COC form that says shipped by. So there you can put UPS, FedEx. Now if it's a PDC courier, yes, we will accept your samples, and then the courier will accept them and they will relinquish them, and then that'll be documented on the form for you. And again, this tracks the possession, who had the sample, when did they have the sample. Now, if a sample were ever go to court for some reason, and be involved in a litigation, this would be a serious issue than the chain of custody. Most times, your routine compliance, you're doing this frequently, your BOD, your suspended solid, you're familiar with your plant, there's all this QA, you do this chain of custody in there, but it's not getting that ultimate level of scrutiny as it would in a litigation. If you have somebody who's polluting, you're trying to nail somebody, so to speak, then it can be very important to know, okay, from the time it was collected, you had it, you gave it to so-and-so, who gave it to them, delivered it to the lab, then dates, times, who had the possession of that sample, because if somebody wants to throw rocks at that sample result, they're going to say, how do you know somebody didn't mess with the sample? How do you know, okay, we got a high result, well, did somebody sabotage the sample? That again, that doesn't typically come up, but I have seen a few instances where, lawyers, litigations have looked at, where was the sample, who collected it, when did you have it, who did you give it to, why did it take, 2 days from the time it went from here to there and got to the lab 3 days. Like I say, that's your chain of custody. And that can be a serious, like I say, typically it's not, but that can be a serious issue. So you just have to have a tight chain of custody. Temperature. This is another thing now that is becoming a big deal. Okay. When you look at, it's always been there, but I think we're seeing enforcement of this now, probably more than in the past. Every method that you look out there will have some statement or something that will define the thermal preservation. Now, it may say none. For instance, trace metals, or if you're in drinking water, fluorides, you do not have to refrigerate or keep cold that particular bottle for your trace metals analysis, or for your fluoride, for instance. Other, BOD, solids, ammonias, phenols, all your SOC things, those all, when you look in 40, the Code of Federal Register, 40 CFR, Part 136, where all these acceptable methods are listed, then there will be a list in there that will say, and we'll get to the container part of that in a minute, but it will say the temperature on there. And if it has to have the thermal preservation, as they call it, it will more than likely specify less than 6.0 degrees C. Okay, so, and that's at the time the sample is received at the laboratory. So on that chain of custody form, there's a little couple sections, that say for lab use on there. When we receive that sample, we will take the temperature of a representative bottle from your cooler. Now your cooler, your container may have multiple samples, but we're going to record one sample temperature on there. And that should be, and again, we can't just say less than 6 degrees. It has to be 0.1 degrees C, greater than that, or less than or equal to 6.0 degrees centigrade. Can't be, there's little wiggle room, on some, when weight, is it frozen? Wintertime, that happens, frozen samples. Is it frozen solid and it cracked the bottle? Yeah, that's a reject, no question. Was there one little crystal of ice in there? Did you observe that visually? What was the temperature? And you're taking temperatures of these sample containers with an infrared gun, because we don't open the container, stick a thermometer in there, because now you've got potential cross-contamination in there. So we're taking an infrared gun, and we're, kind of like now with the COVID stuff, when they take, this contactless temperature thing, they point that little thing at your forehead, and it's the same thing. It's a little infrared device that's measuring the temperature of that surface. So, you can, we have seen an instance, your ice is well below the freezing point. You pop it out of a good solid packed thing of ice. The bottle's not frozen, the water's not frozen, but the outside of that container might tell you it's frozen. So like I say, there's some, those kind of issues do come up, and we address those. But if it comes in and it's 25 degrees, in the summertime, and it's a parameter that needs to be cold, then that will get documented on there. Drinking water, there's not much question if it's a method that requires it and it's outside of the temperature criteria, it's a reject. We notify the people, submitting the sample was received out of temperature. You have to get new bottles, we'll send you new bottles, pick up new bottles, but you got to reanalyze that. You got to resample that one. They will not accept those. Wastewater, again, technically that's required. We're not seeing samples rejected because of that. But and again, this is unofficial, but some will say, and there's a spot on the COC, in the lab part where it says, was it received on ice? Was there evidence that the chill process was started? If it's 8 degrees and it's documented that it was received on ice and the chill process was started, that will be much more beneficial than 25 degrees and no ice, no chill process on there. Again, that ultimate scrutiny, would it hold up in a court of law? The method says your BOD sample has to be received at 6 degrees or less. Comes in at 7 degrees. Okay. Your EPA inspector might, understand that, but lawyers and a jury, though, might not. If it gets to that point. Like I say, I'll say in most cases it's not current, but it will be documented though. When we receive the samples, that COC that we receive, it will become a part of your report. Then because it has the chain of, all that information on there has the chain of custody on it, where we've received it, we documented, was it on ice, had the chill process started, what was the temperature of those, that scanned into our system, and that typically that will be the final page of your report. So that information's out there. Okay, containers. Then this is another thing that can cause the ultimate scrutiny here, is just like the temperature, then each method that we do has a required container, and it will specify which containers it can be. Typically, anything that's plastic can also be glass, or could also be glass. Doesn't have to be, but it could be. But there's a lot that cannot be plastic that have to be glass. And they're typically organics methods. So in the method, it will say, acceptable container, glass, plastic, fluoropolymer, which there's a couple applications of that, but it's basically glass or plastic then. And again, if it can be either one, it'll say, and then this again, you go back to your 40 CFR Part 136, then it kind of drives the boat on these things where it'll say plastic or glass, but that's in these methods then. So also some can be clear or amber, they're specified in there. Does it have to have a preservative or not? BOD, suspended solids, chlorides, sulfates, fluorides, a lot of, there's that not all inclusive, but there's examples of those are unpreserved things, okay? A lot of the methods then will specify a preservative. Heavy metal, trace metals, nitric acid preserved, ammonias, phenols, TOCs, TOXs, grease and oils. They might not specify the acid. Sometimes you have leeway, hydrochloric, sulfuric, but it will say pH less than 2 on there. Again, in the laboratory, should be familiar with those. So if when you're setting up a project, you're picking up your sample bottles, that if you're not sure, ask us. And the lab will provide you, the lab should provide you, I should say, then all the necessary proper preserved bottles, so that and that's again up front important, to know exactly what test parameters, because you throw that one little extra test in there, which may or may not have a unique bottle then. So you get those from the laboratory, and you want to label the bottles. Now, some people, may think that you have to write way too much information on every label in every bottle. Kind of the bottom line is the label that's on the bottle has to be able to conclusively correlate to a line item on your COC. So if you've got a permit renewal, say you got 15 bottles, well, you don't have to write the client name, all that stuff repetitively on every sample label, but you do have to put enough on there. You have to say effluent 710, influent 710. Enough information on there, or put, GPSD, or sometimes with other laboratories we get code numbers, sample numbers on there. But however that is, then there has to be enough on the bottle label so that we can group the bottles, all the bottles for a given sample together, and say, okay, all of these containers, and there's 10 of them, and that conclusively lines up and agrees with the first line on your COC form. So again, that's the label part, and make sure that's legible too, and make sure that the pen, the label, the system that you're using then doesn't run or bleed when you put it on ice. We have had that too. We had, simple ones, some tap samples, that happens. Sometimes you resample. I've seen ones where we had soil samples, and it was a drill rig, and they collected all the samples, and the drill rig packed up and went home, and the samples hit the lab, and all the ink washed off of there. Fortunately, the person used a ballpoint pen. We literally put those sample labels under a microscope and could see the indentation on the label for those, so that, like I said, that was an extreme example, but you don't want to have the samples show up at the lab and you've got 5 different sample locations in there that all have the same container or types of containers in there, and we can't tell which is the influent, which is the effluent, which is the lift station. Those kind of examples. So it's gotta be legible. It has to stand up, to the ice, or to getting wet, not run, and then it has to be unique. Like I say, must correlate and fill the bottles full, particularly if it's wastewater. I don't think in most instances you're going to have a shortage of your effluent or your influent. Don't scrimp on the bottles. Fill the bottle full. The bottle that's sent to you is designed, specified such that there's enough in there. I have seen some instances monitoring wells and that where there just not enough sample in there, and There are, some of them in like trace metals, for instance, we could get by, with less than a full bottle. There's other things, volatiles, that. I mean, you got to have that bottle full, So if you get into an application like that, call the laboratory. Say, you've got 3 liters worth of sample bottles, and I can only get you 1 liter of volume. And they'll help you walk through, where it's critical that the bottle has to be absolutely full and where there's a little leeway. But the basic concept is fill the sample bottle. Okay, holding times. You kind of touched on that a little bit before. Again, this isn't something that the laboratory made up or created to try to make their life easier or your life more difficult. These are, again, just like the bottle type, the preservatives, it's specified in the method. Then you want to plan ahead such that you be familiar with these hold times and, watch as, 4th of July last weekend, watch out for the holidays. If you're not sure, when the lab will have a holiday, especially when July 4th was on a Saturday, be aware of those kind of things and realize that when your sample hits the door, then, there's a holding time on there. And if you're like drinking water, nitrate's a good example, 48 hours. Don't hit the door at hour 46. Chances are you're probably not going to make it if that happens. It could. I mean, if you call ahead of time and say, hey, blah, 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 happened, my nitrate sample, I'm going to have it there at 1 o'clock, the whole time's up at 3. Yeah, I mean, if you kind of grease the skids ahead of time, they might be able to help you with that. But shows up in the cooler hits the door with 2 hours left, and there's 50 coolers in our vestibule. Like I say, there's a good chance, you're not going to make that whole time. So be aware of those. BODs, that's a common one, 48 hours. We initiate analysis for BODs on Mondays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, 4 out of 6 days. We have a routine crew comes in on, we don't do very many on Saturdays, but the ones we get on Mondays then are, the 5 days is up on Saturday. So, that accommodates, if you have to collect it, like, if you have industries, or if you're a 7-day-a-week, for example, most of those tend to have in-house laboratories, but say you do that and your lab guy's on vacation, you're going to subcontract them for a couple of weeks, your Sunday sample, then you want to make sure you get that to us on Monday, because then we will set it on Monday. Tuesday, that's kind of the odd one, because the 5 days is up on Sunday. So, I mean, that's why there's no way, don't initiate those on Tuesday. But just, be aware of those kind of things, so that you can, collect samples, deliver samples, and, meet those. 5-day-a-week ones, we've got quite a few of those. Yeah, you collect it on Tuesday. Yeah, we've got till, whatever time you collect it on Tuesday, we've got till Thursday. So there, there's opportunity on that. But just, be aware. Shipping, then also, that's tough on the temperatures. That can be tough on the holding times. Historically, I'll say UPS within the state of Illinois, ground delivery, we historically have got those the next day. When the COVID pandemic struck, some of that didn't happen. It's getting better, but can't count on that. They will not guarantee it. It happens most times, but they can't. So just, be aware of those kind of things. Use courier services, but just be aware that there is a hold time on these analysis. Now, I always want to point out to PK, lead and copper, that's the easiest one. Your hold time is 180 days once the sample is acidified. There is no temperature requirement for lead and copper. So if your drinking water supply, you're having trouble with your homeowners getting your bottles back to us, your first hurdle with lead and coppers is they have to be preserved within 14 days. So if the sample's collected on day one, I mean, it sits around 3 or 4 days, room temperature, you get it to the lab after it's been collected for a week, that's not going to be a problem with lead and coppers. We don't put the preservative in those ahead of time because we don't want that milliliter nitric acid in that bottle when it goes out to the homeowners. Kids play with the bottles. Dogs will chew. Dogs love to chew the caps off bottles. They don't want that acid, in your dog's mouth or on your kid's hands. So that's why the lead and coppers go out unpreserved. So, but we do have to get those back and have the preservative added, have them preserved within 14 days of collection. Now, once they're preserved, got 180 days, and which is probably good, because when IDPH started making schools and daycares do this, we got thousands of these samples at, within a few days, a lot of times, and you just can't process them. We can get them preserved all pretty quick, but doing the analysis, was running 3 weeks sometime. So, yeah. But anyway, point is, all analysis will have a hold time on there. Most analysis have a temperature requirement that has to be the 0.1 to 6 degrees. Say there's a few exceptions to that. Lead and copper is the most notable, and fluorides is the most notable one to that. If it's drinking water, again, it will be rejected. There's no, there's no if, and, or buts about that with drinking water. Okay, wastewater, I'll say here, it may. We don't see a lot of that, but it could. Avoid hold time exceedances if all possible on there. And I mention also, and this, wastewater related, by your permits, you'll have pH, chlorine, dissolved oxygen on there. Realize, that pH meter, dissolved oxygen meter, there's some expense. You're only doing this once a month, perhaps, if you're small enough. In theory, those are to be done in the field at the time of sample collection, or basically within 15 minutes, I think is the way it officially looks from when you collect that sample. So if your plant, you can grab it out back, carry it in the plant, do it within 15 minutes. But any sample that comes to the laboratory for pH, residual chlorine, either total or free, dissolved oxygen, will have a data qualifier on it. Again, I have seen, some of the EPA inspector guys won't allow that. Some will, one person put it, will overlook that. They won't reject the data. But again, they could. So, keep that in mind. Those parameters, in theory, you should be doing them at the time you collect the sample. We do a fair amount of them in the lab. It hasn't caused a problem, again, for wastewater. But we don't do those in the lab routinely for drinking water. But, your back T samples, your nitrates, those are the main, the shorter ones. If those aren't done within hold time, they won't, the data's no good. Okay. I think I'm about on my time schedule here. I don't know, Jason, how are we doing? Questions? If somebody has questions, or if anybody in the room has a question here, like I said, we only got about 8 people in the room here, but I can take those questions, or you can certainly submit them to me via email. And my email is kstepping@pdclab.com, or you're dealing with one of our other project managers, email them. They can answer questions for you. Okay, again, thanks GPSD for hosting us here and your support of this, and likely we'll have a different format going down the road here, a Zoom or GoTo, and we'll try to see how that goes the next time. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess we had a good start right off the bat. My part didn't go through this morning. But again, thanks, Kurt. This is probably going to be our new norm, that we're going to look at doing either Zoom or GoTo as our virtual thing for our next meetings. Jason here from Pure Sanitary is going to check into that for us. It's about $200 a year, so right now we'll start doing it that way. For this meeting, if you want to email me your information, and once we get the approval number from the EPA, I will email it to you. My email is publicworks at mtco.com. And then in the future, with the other virtual meetings we have, you'll get credit if you're a paid member. So, we got, I think Brian said we have about 41 members right now, so it's probably going to grow. We're probably right now going to keep all the virtual ones at about an hour, somewhere in that range. I think it's a little hard to do 2 hours and everybody's busy and sitting in front of your computer or on your phone or whatever watching for a meeting. So bear with us. We'll get through this. I think our next one will probably plan in September. That's what we're looking for. Don't really have a speaker lined up yet, but we're looking at some different things. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Seriously.